My name is Tim Abbott. This has been organised by the West Belfast Civil Rights Commemoration Committee, but I've had the joy over the last 12 months to be the Secretary of the Civil Rights Commemoration Committee for the 50th anniversary of civil rights. And we've done over 50 events, partnered with Slugger Tool to try to ensure that we had a inclusive, reflective discussion narrative, not only about civil rights then, but about civil rights issues today. I think it's been very important. It's been very inclusive. It's engaged unionism, Republicans, civic society, the faith community, and we've, I think, had a very interesting discussion. A number of us in the committee and people in society are now talking about we move into a period where civil rights sort of came to, it was more difficult in terms of maintaining a non-violent civil rights movement, and violent politics took over. And obviously in August '69, and there'll be I'm sure a lot of documentaries over the next 6 months to highlight that sort of change into a more violent part of our history in 1969. And one of the discussions in terms of how do we remember those events in 1969 and sort of the huge number of people who lost their lives, especially in the first 5 years. So can I introduce you to our speakers? Seamus is going to start. I'll just introduce it. Maureen Hetherington is from the Junction in Derry, a major community organisation, and she's been helped create Towards Understanding and Healing project, and she's worked on community relations issues for a long period in Derry and across the north. In 2015, she was awarded the Community Relations Award for Exceptional Achievement by the Community Relations Council, and they said she led the way with her creative vision for the Londonderry area, taking risks, establishing relationships, and building the stepping stones for peace in our community. Next we have Seamus O'Hara, who is from the Junction in Derry as well. Seamus has a long history of working in Nigeria, Kenya, Sudan, Ethiopia, but he has been working in conflict mediation here and there for many years, and has also been involved in the Towards Understanding and Healing programme and the Ethical and Shared Remembering project, which has been very important in recent years. Next person doesn't need any introduction. Nelson McCausland, former MLA for North Belfast, former Minister for the DUP. He's now a columnist for the Belfast Telegraph, and appears regularly on the Talkback and Nolan shows, giving his views. So you're very welcome, Nelson, as well. And last but not least is Dr. Gladys Gagnon, who is a Queen's University Research Fellow in Sociology. And she will obviously be talking about some of her work, which includes work on reconciliation through dealing with the past, learning from Presbyterian responses to the Troubles. So Seamus, could I ask you to maybe open up and give us some perspectives about the need for ethical remembering and commemoration?
On the question, can we remember ethically? Here's my quick answer. Yes, we can, with difficulty. And then can I add as well, but boy, do we need to do so. We absolutely do. Now, in terms of the why of the needing to, we could go on forever. I could go on forever about what, basically we haven't got over the past, we haven't dealt with it. There is the baggage that individuals and whole communities are carrying from their traumatic experiences, and passing it on to new generation. This is transgenerational stuff. And whether it's been passed on accurately or otherwise is another question. I'm aware too of narratives from the Troubles that have substantial traction, whether they are about dead heroes or them and us stuff, but they have traction with consequences. And there is the present political impasse rooted, as I see it, in an agenda that doesn't have to do with the present, but the past. When critical and urgent issues in the present agenda are being kicked down the road, I draw encouragement from the experience of the project that Tim has mentioned, the Junctions Project, Ethical and Shared Remembering, which has had to do with the centenaries of events during the period 1912 to 23 that, to put it mildly, have cast a shadow over this island ever since. What we have learned is that if the journey is to be useful and constructive, that journey of remembering the past, in that process, right from the beginning, with the help of Maureen and Dr. Johnson McMaster, we were very conscious of the need to have an ethics-based framework for journeying, for the journey to be useful, to be constructive, and not counterproductive, because that's a risk. And we had the good fortune to have access to such a framework, thanks to Johnson McMaster. What I can report from the experience is that the process has enabled people to move from division around different versions of our history towards working together towards the future. Now, can I say about the events of 100 years ago, Solemn Ulster Covenant, Battle of Somme, Easter Rising, those were issues that aren't without an emotive content as well. And it's in that context that I think can happily report that we found, in an atmosphere of respect for where everybody is coming from, that we could get to a place where people could feel at ease with each other around the many complexities of what happened back then. And it's from the encouragement of that experience that I am encouraged that to answer yes we can, as well as yes we should, engage with the events of 50 years ago. The troubles, yes, they are more recent. The emotions are more raw. And also, given the abject failure of both state and paramilitary actors in the Troubles to do the right thing for the living victims of the conflict in terms of truth recovery and justice, I'm conscious that it's going to be desperately painful for victims. But my experience tells me that the general public are way ahead of the posse. That it is from the privilege of an engagement, Maureen and myself, with people in communities all over. In terms of a willingness to engage in honest and constructive dialogue with each other towards finding release from the past, towards being able to engage together with both present and future. And boy, engage we have to, we must. There is just need for space and opportunities to do so. Now, could I just unpack a little bit? This is in terms of the framework that we used for the centenary commemorations. One of them is to remember the context. 50 years ago is actually a different place from now. Not entirely, but it is different. One thing that occurs to me is there were legitimate grievances then. Civil rights violations that had been festering for some time, and alongside that there was the stubborn refusal of the authorities to address them. In retrospect, here's my view, that it was not clearly enough recognized that the legitimate grievances were not the preserve of any one community. But the point I want to make about the difference 50 years on, those grievances have been addressed. They are not today's agenda. Other issues are. The context is different now from then, and present dialogue needs to reflect that fact throughout. Another one is the need in terms of the Troubles to remember all of what happened and to acknowledge the extent to which one thing led to another. Atrocity was followed by reprisal. Outrage and incendiary language found further expression in further killings, random and otherwise, and further killings led to further killings. Remembering whole like this is crucial to avoiding all the whataboutery, all the selective amnesia, and the zooming in on a particular event as if they're not interconnected with what went before and what followed. This, by the way, needless to say, is not, of course, to excuse or exonerate anybody, no matter who, for atrocities and crimes. Thirdly, it's the future that matters. Any remembering, if it is to be useful, must be towards creating a future that bears no resemblance to past strife. There are ways of remembering the past that ends up with us with our backs to the future, and we're rather good at it. The alternative, which in our project we talk about as remembering the future, is to start with the vision of the future and do our remembering of the past through the lens of what we want the future to be about. And there I'll finish, and Maureen will take over. Is that okay? Thanks.
And as Seamus says, we've learned a lot from the decade of centenaries, and whether it was events in Ireland or World War I, it has taken 100 years to arrive at a more critical, balanced perspective. And it has taken that time for information to be revealed, to emerge, and it has come out in the way of statements and documents and newly released information. And in many cases, what we know 100 years later is much greater than what was known 50 years ago. And that necessitates even the reappraisal and rewriting of the narrative that is a perspective of time, that comes with a perspective of times. So, after only 50 years, we have very much an incomplete picture. We have a less informed picture. So we don't have anywhere near the information apart from being within living memory, and that is very raw. We don't have a big informed picture that will allow us to make some kind of reasonable judgment about the events. So we can commemorate anniversaries knowing that our commemoration is very incomplete and our remembering is very incomplete. It's very much provisional and will certainly not be the last word if there is ever a last word. So therefore we need to approach the anniversaries with a great deal of sensitivity, but also a realization of the incompleteness and inadequacy of anything that we do. So it would therefore be highly dangerous to use commemoration as a weapon. I just want to elaborate that. So for me, remembering ethically, it's about critical remembering. And it's where militarized politics have no place, and it's where violence is not denied or justified. Ethical remembering raises critical questions about the use of violence to deal with difference and the resolution or defense of political objectives or causes. Uncritical remembering is a failure to learn from history. Ethical remembering, on the other hand, acknowledges the destructiveness of violence and its destructive legacy, and it creates a different demilitarized political future. And I want to just say about the need, at that time when we developed the ethical and remembering, there were three areas: narrative hospitality, narrative flexibility, and narrative plurality, that was really crucial in developing the ethics of remembering. And the narrative hospitality, that was the generosity to hear all of the stories, to sit and listen, to listen to the stranger, but to be inclusive in how we hear those stories and accepting them. The flexibility and plurality, that's about letting go some of the absolutes and the certainties and being open to fresh interpretations of the past, given the information and the new information that was unfolding. And then acknowledging the different historical perspectives and the interpretation of perspectives was really important. And those three areas, that was really important for us on how we might remember and do things maybe differently. So we need a politics of public memory. And public memory is a politics of public memory that can facilitate a vibrant, democratic debate over the ways in which a traumatic past can or should be remembered. Because memory shapes, molds, and it frames narratives of the past in the minds of communities and individuals. To be ethical, we need to appreciate the complex emotive realities of the political landscapes. We need to engage all sections of civic society, and particularly the silenced and marginalised voices, and create a public memory that is inclusive. So it can be done, but it's a big challenge, and it's the only way in which we can move forward.
I just wanted to begin by recognizing that the Junction's Ethical and Shared Remembering project, I think, is giving us a really excellent starting point for our conversation. And this is remembering that the devastating human cost of violence should inform all our efforts to commemorate the Troubles. So, that human cost of violence, that I think is what we should be remembering. And I think that your project has done a great job doing that. And the project also reminds us that the purpose of commemoration, I think, should be that the violence should never happen again. So these are really solid starting points. But I think I'm not entirely sure if talking about it in terms of ethical remembering or ethical commemoration is always entirely effective. And now this isn't in any way a criticism of the project or the work. It is in some ways, I suppose, a semantic criticism, which you might expect from an academic. But as we know, semantics or the language we use is really important in terms of public discourse. And the reason why I think the word ethical might be slightly problematic in light of the Junction's emphasis on this devastating human cost of violence is that there are always going to be those amongst us who are not willing to assent to the idea that violence is never or almost never justified, even in the face of overwhelming human suffering. So with that in mind, I think there's a danger that the word ethical conjures up images of adjudicating between what was right and what was wrong during the Troubles, and identifying right and wrong ways to remember what happened. So in the name of determining what is ethical, it could be quite easy to descend into the time-honored practice of demanding that other people repent of their sins in sackcloth and ashes, to use that language, or engage in the endless rounds of whataboutery that we're so familiar with. Now, over the last 3 years, I've been working on 2 research projects, one in partnership with the Presbyterian Church on how Presbyterians responded to the Troubles, and the other is a biography of Father Jerry Reynolds from Clonard Monastery, and books based on those 2 projects will be published later this year. So I want to share 2 brief reflections based on that research. So first, in light of what I've said there about perhaps some potential problems with ethical remembering, I want to raise a question whether it would be constructive to start talking about gracious remembering. So this idea comes from the Presbyterian Project, and what this involved was interviewing 122 people with a variety of experiences of the Troubles. So these would have included ordained ministers, victims, security forces, those affected by loyalist paramilitarism, including ex-combatants, emergency responders and healthcare workers, quiet peacemakers, so people involved in peace work at the grassroots, politicians, people who left Presbyterianism, and a few critical friends, as we call them, from outside Presbyterianism who could sort of speak into and comment on the church. So amongst those people, we found stories of faith and doubt, fear and courage, suffering and forgiveness, division and reconciliation, so that whole range of experiences that really prevent you from making generalizations. And I think that full range of human experiences should be part of our remembering of the Troubles, and I think that's something Seamus and Maureen have already mentioned as well. But in addition to all that, some Presbyterians talk to us about grace. So this is where that graciousness that I'm emphasizing comes in. And grace would have been defined, I suppose, in different ways by different people, but I think you can conceive of it as free and unmerited favor, or courteous goodwill. So for them, grace is a gift, one that individuals can receive from others, or that they can also receive from themselves, extending grace to yourself, or receive from God, or that they also can bestow on others. So both individuals and communities having this capacity to bestow grace upon others. Now, grace, I think, also remembers wrongdoing, but it's this gift-like quality of grace that mitigates against that divisive adjudication about what was right and what is wrong. Now, I know it might be quite easy for this to sound glib, a sort of cheap grace, and this admittedly must be guarded against. Related to that, when we interviewed people, we didn't ask them direct questions about forgiveness, but a majority of people, including almost every victim we spoke with, introduced it to our conversations. And the key point from that is that forgiveness is not forgetting. And forgiveness meant that they wanted to remember their loved ones and what happened to them, but their preferences about how to remember them were not uniform. So in terms of any type of commemoration, what is going to please one person may not have any impact on another and may make somebody else quite angry. So everybody has different preferences. I also can't say that every person that we interviewed was fully forgiven or fully healed, but for some people, they remembered what happened in ways that they hoped would create a better future. So this is quite similar to what Seamus and Maureen said about remembering the future. You start at the future you want to get to, and you work back from there. And maybe that's where forgiveness comes out of, with that, that look to the future. So all this made me wonder if talking about gracious remembering could be a more helpful way to prompt some constructive conversations about commemorating the Troubles. So my second point then is that we should not just remember the death and destruction. I also think we should remember and celebrate the people among us, like Father Jerry Reynolds, so people who devoted their lives to peacemaking. Now, I don't have time to give you a full summary of the biography if you're not familiar with Jerry's work at Witness, but he's best known for his ecumenical and interchurch work in Clonard between 1983 and 2015, so he passed away in 2015. One thing that really struck me about Jerry, researching his biography, that he was overwhelmingly resilient in the face of any setbacks, and he realized the cumulative value of small steps in the right direction. But I also think it's not just the exemplars like Jerry who should be remembered. And this really came home to me with one Presbyterian that we interviewed. He said there were lots of people who will never know about unsung heroes. It was our job to keep normality normal in faith and work, socializing in the town, shopping. Because if you didn't, then you were failing in your job, not just as a Presbyterian, but as a human being. So I think we should also find ways to remember people like him. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Nelson, over to you. Obviously, I have an office there in Northumberland Street, which overlooks the International Peace Wall. So when you open the windows every day, you have ex-combatants from Republicans handing political tours over to ex-combatants from loyalist communities. And when you listen to some of the narratives and the propaganda, you wonder where the history of the North has gone. It's very singular narratives. Would you have a concern that narrative is becoming very strong, and the wider narratives about the Troubles and commemoration are not as strong as they should be?
You certainly make a very valid point there, in that too often the voices of what are called combatants, and generally you're referring there to people who are either loyalist or Republican paramilitaries. There were many other combatants, including the police and so on, whose voice isn't very often heard in these things. But quite often that can produce, I think, a skewed understanding, in that the vast majority of people were not involved as combatants. And I think one of the lessons there that I've drawn from the past year, and as you said there, I've gone to a number of the events that have been organised in relation to the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Movement. One of the things is that it's been an opportunity over a year to reflect on, to learn about, to better understand, to go back and think about, because there were things that I thought I remembered, and when I went back and checked them, I'd misremembered. And I think there were things that I went back and looked at, and I hadn't really understood them at the time, even though I'd lived through that. What it was the opportunity for a fulsome reflection on it, with 50 years of hindsight. That needs to be inclusive, because it was only through listening to people from Republican, Labour, unionists, different backgrounds, and all their different elements. You started to put the pieces together, and you did get a better understanding because it was almost like a jigsaw. And there were bits that fitted together, I thought, in various ways that confirmed things that I had believed previously, and other things that were challenged. It was important, therefore, to have that year insofar as we're now moving into 50th anniversaries of the Troubles, and we are facing, therefore, 40 years possibly of 50th anniversaries. Certainly 30-odd years. So we had the 50th anniversary of civil rights, we had the 100th anniversary of 1912 and 1916, but those came and went. There wasn't that much really between 1912 commemorations and 1916, whether it be the Somme or the Easter Rising. But I think it's the fact that you're now going to have almost on a daily basis events coming up that will be remembered and commemorated in various ways. And whilst I would have, growing up in North Belfast and living in North Belfast, this constant image in my head of, you read the paper and 3 people were shot dead in North Belfast last night, and it got an inch and a half on the front page of the Telegraph. Things were passed over very, very quickly. Life was treated very, very lightly. And there was a horror about it that we lived through and you almost became acclimatized to. We're now going to have an opportunity 50 years on to reflect on all of these things and how many of them there will be and what will be remembered and what will be forgotten. But it does afford an opportunity to reflect on that and to learn from it. The one or two caveats I would have are these. We already have annual commemorations. There are people celebrating when it comes to the Battle of the Boyne, we celebrate whatever it is, the 329th or whatever. We don't have to wait for a 30th or whatever, or a 100th or 500th, whatever. It's the point there that these things happen all the time. Every year there are events to commemorate events that happened in the Troubles, whether it be to commemorate something that was done by loyalists or something that was done by Republicans, or an event in which the state forces, the police and the army were involved. And on top of that, you also have, I think, forthcoming the overlaying of 100th anniversaries on top of the 50th. So there will be an attempt there, I think, maybe to link some of these things, and there will be people going back to 150th and 200th anniversaries on top of all the 50th anniversaries that are coming up. Commemoration, remembrance, is often used in Northern Ireland to feed, to fuel a sense of victimhood. Unionists and nationalists may not look at things in exactly the same way. I'm not thinking there in just a political term, in terms of events. But I think that remembrance and so on can be very different. How people respond to suffering that they've endured. I'll give you an example of that. I often think of an elderly lady now who lives in North Belfast. In 1969, on one night, she had 2 relatives shot by the army. Now, she's convinced that the 2 relatives were absolutely innocent, and circumstantial evidence would suggest they were. Generally, if you're going out to do something wrong, you're not going to go out in your best suit and white shirt and your best tie. That's not the way you go about it. But the 2 men were shot dead in different parts of North Belfast in one night. What does she want out of that? How does she want? All she is interested in is getting to the point where they're cleared, that they're seen to be killed wrongly. Is she looking for a public inquiry? No. Is she looking for an annual commemorative event? No. Is she looking for some sort of restitution for it? No. All she wants to do is to be able to do, and she's well into her 80s, that in due course when she goes to her grave, she will go having cleared their names. And she hasn't succeeded in doing that yet. It's never really been properly investigated. The way that it was looked at by the police was inadequate. But it's very different from the highly politicized campaigns that you see around certain other things that happened around the same time. And in fact, the army unit that was involved in those shootings was involved in other shootings that are being campaigned over by others. Above all else, if there's one thing that we can get out of this, it has to be that we move forward into a society where we do not create another generation of young people who become embroiled in violence. I would hate to see us get to the point where we see a young generation growing up that is radicalized, that is so angry, that has been fed a diet of pseudo-history that leads on to another generation being embroiled in this. We're a lot of years on from the ceasefires, but there's too many homes, and I just think of North Belfast and the Shankill, where paramilitarism is still wreaking havoc, where people are still dying of issues around drugs, people are committing suicide, people are being punished over things that they hadn't done but they had wronged somebody who had the capacity to hurt them. When you see the pain and the hurt in those families, it just says to me, we cannot allow this to happen again. We've got to call a halt to this and actually say this is about how we create a shared Northern Ireland that people can live together in peace and harmony.
Something that Nelson said, because I think it was implicit, but I think it'd be really helpful to make it explicit. He was talking about, the example of the woman in North Belfast who would like to go to her grave with her mind at ease. I think there's a difference between the state and its ability to help us address the legacy of the past. If the state were able to do that, that is something that would really help that woman. So there's that, the state's role in addressing the legacy of the past, and we have loads of options for that, we know. And then there's this issue of commemoration, which is, our overarching topic today. And commemoration is a part of dealing with the past, but it's set in that wider context that you brought up about, I think, the state needing to have a role in addressing the legacy of the past. So commemoration can't be seen separate from that, but it is a slightly different thing. So I think they're related, but I think it's helpful to make that distinction in this discussion.
Can I thank Maureen, Seamus, Nelson and Gladys for coming along today. I think it was very invigorating and very important debate and discussion.